Okay. Welcome everyone to the Global Education Colloquium. Nice to see some new faces today. And welcome to those of you who are online. My name is Christy Kelly and I'm a faculty member here in the School of Education. We're very, very excited to have today Dr. Marty Sommer here talking about menstrual health from a global perspective and particularly as it links to education. Dr. Sommer is an associate professor of socio-medical sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health. Her particular arenas of expertise include conducting participatory research with adolescents, understanding and promoting health transitions to adulthood, and the intersection of public health and education, gender and sexual health. For many years, her research has explored girls' experiences of menstruation, puberty, and schooling, and the ways in which the onset of puberty may be disrupted girls' education and healthy transition to young adulthood. She presently leads the Gender Adolescent Transitions and Environment, called GATE program. She's a senior editor for the journal Global Public Health and is the president of an organization called Grow and Know. This nonprofit focuses on developing puberty books for girls and boys in partnership with ministries of education around the world. If you are new to the Global Education Colloquium, welcome again. Dr. Sommer will give her talk, and then afterwards we'll have question and answer, plenty of time for conversation. We have people who are live streaming and people in the room. So if you're live streaming, please chat your questions in, and we'll be happy to ask them at the end of the session. So thank you very much, and thank you for giving your time and expertise today.
Sure. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for inviting me here today, and for all of you online. Much appreciate you logging in. I don't know what time zones you're in, but I find people love talking about periods. It doesn't really matter what time of day. And it's nice to see gender diversity in the room, because sometimes I do talks on menstruation, and I look at it as a sea of menstruators, which is wonderful, and I pose a bunch of questions, which I'm not going to do today. So we'll just dive in, but it's good. I think this is an issue of relevance to everybody, and so it's nice to have a diversity of people in the room. I do have questions for you too, as education experts, so I'm hoping to learn from you along with being here today. So do I just do next slide? What am I, or should I go click it? No, I can do it. It's all good. So what I'm going to talk about today, addressing menstruation globally, I've been working on this issue since 2004, and so it's really a look back. The World Health Organization last summer asked me to put together, sort of think through where were we, where have we been, where are we right now, and where do we need to go. And so it is coming at it with a bit of a public health lens, but there's been a huge intersection with education. So I will talk about that as well. And also I want to talk about the areas beyond education that we need to understand more, along with what we need sort of at this point. So just a note on terminology. If you are not deeply embedded in this space the way I live and breathe menstruation all day long and evening and think about it all the time, there is a lot of discussion now around what are we calling it. For those of us who've been working on it for a very long time, MHM, menstrual hygiene management, is the term that was coined before I became involved, and I'll briefly go through that. And then there's all sorts of variations around what people are calling it for various reasons. And I'm happy to talk about that a bit more in the Q&A. Probably won't spend time on the talk today. To me, I think whatever you call it, the issue is you're thinking about menstruation, how its onset and management, and the issue, discrimination or stigma around it sort of impacts the lives of people who menstruate. And so the terminology, while very important, is sort of less of what I'm going to focus on today. I put this just because I was less certain of those in the room and on live stream. Sexual reproductive health, SRH, we use that phrase, that sort of acronym all the time in public health. It's quite relevant, but just to make sure we were all on the same page. So I don't know if you can see this with the lighting. This is a quote from the first time I ever did research on this issue in Tanzania in 2006. The first day I menstruated, I felt very bad. I thought I was dying. I didn't know anything about puberty. I thought I wanted to urinate, but when I went to the latrine, I saw my underpants were bloody. I told my sister about it. So I have now seen quotes like this in country after country after country, which is just to try and bring you all to the same page in terms of the gap in information, the fear, not knowing who to talk to, concern that something was quite wrong, and sort of who a girl may or may not go and talk to about what's happened to her. country after country, we've also found girls know very little before their first period, and then sometimes they do go find someone afterwards or get education. But there does seem to be this universality in many cultures and contexts where there's a real silence up until it happens, and then they may learn something. So in terms of the historical time periods of where this movement has been, and if you read Newsweek or Time Magazine, it really pops up a lot in the media today, which was definitely not the case when I started working on it in 2004, which really was around when other people started to work on it. And I'll go through each of these 4 phases, as I'm calling them, over the course of the talk. But just to say, up until 2004, there was very little happening on it the way I'm going to talk about it conceptually today. During this period, 2005 to 2011, there started to be a burst of small-scale research. The next phase, 2012 to 2015, is when we really started to get global engagement and new kinds of global networking and sort of sharing of best practice and learning. And then the last 2 years is when I think it sort of exploded. It's when it started to pop up in the regular media. Donors and governments started to invest in it. So I will talk about each one of those. Again, I hope you can see this. It's wonderful and bright in here, but I may have picked the wrong colors. What I've done is blocked out these time periods into population of interest, the kind of research that was happening, the types of interventions that were going on, and the milestones that were achieved. And so up until around 2004 and 5, the interest in menstruation was really adult women. There wasn't a lot of conversation around girls, except for sort of much more sort of psychological or biomedical research around the dropping age of puberty and girls' anxiety and experiences, primarily in rich countries, around getting their period. So HIC, high-income country, versus LMIC, low and middle-income country. The focus in high-income countries like the US was really around menstruation as relevant to fertility. And in lower-income and middle-income countries, it was a really family planning fertility agenda. In terms of research, in the 80s, there were a lot of sort of psych-based attitude surveys around getting your first period and the impact of that. Some surveys done sort of in qualitative evidence around the experience, not a lot. And then in higher income countries, what you did see is the building of an evidence base that when girls get their period early or they don't have enough information, there are these associations with depression, having sex early, dropping out of school. We have very little data about that from other regions of the world, and I'll come back to that because that is quite critical, particularly for your perspective around risky behaviors and dropping out of school. Interventions were very small. UNHCR, the UN body which responds for refugee health, who I do some work with now, did make a commitment back in this window of time that all displaced girls and women should have access to sanitary pads. It was a very narrow commitment around menstruation. And then again, family planning. There was UNICEF did start to talk about this issue. UNICEF really championed this issue, which I'll talk about later. And this is when the MHM term or acronym started to be used. And the reason hygiene's in there is it really came from the water and sanitation community, who really were the main champions until recently and get a lot of credit for getting it on the global space. So just a note on Jackie Kirk, who is the reason we met each other. I was at a conference, the CIES conference, which maybe some of you go to, last spring. Jackie was a very close friend and colleague who was, when I started as a doctoral student, sort of searching online for anything out there possibly on menstruation and periods. At the time, 2004, there was almost nothing. And Jackie had written one chapter on girls' education that mentioned menstruation. She was finishing up her PhD at McGill University and working part-time for the International Rescue Committee. So I reached out to her online. We became very close friends and colleagues. She actually suggested I go to CIES for the first time. And then we ended up writing together on these issues until 2008, when very sadly she was killed in Afghanistan, coming back from a school, doing a girls' education. But she was a fantastic, beautiful writer. And this quote of hers, given the many cultural or traditional beliefs around menstruation, I say this quote, it's our article, but I can tell her writing from my writing, it's much nicer. Given the many cultural and traditional beliefs around menstrual blood and menarche, approaches, solutions must be informed by understandings of local, social, and cultural attitudes and perspectives on the significance of menstruation for girls and their families. Such solutions should be developed based on the insights of the girls themselves, as girls are knowers of their own lives, of the challenges they face, and of possible solutions. And even though I had already done international work, I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer, I did believe fundamentally that you go to the people who are experiencing the issue to find the answers. This sort of Jackie's mantra around girls as the knowers of their own lives has really stayed with me in terms of my own research approaches over the years. So then we moved into this period when I started to do research on this, my doctoral research. So like many of you now, I went to Tanzania and started to look at it. At the time, there started to be an interest in focusing on girls. In high-income countries, it continued to be a very clinical, medical kind of approach to menstruation, whereas in low and middle-income countries, there started to be more of a public health approach. And by public health, I mean population level, not one-on-one doctor-nurse interaction, but really what are the best way to spend our resources to have the biggest impact, to impact the population. So that started to shift. There was a fair amount of formative research. That's what I was doing on the barriers, the way menstruation can create barriers for girls in and out of schools. In terms of interventions, there started to be some attention in emergencies versus development. WASH in schools agenda, are people familiar with that? Okay, so WASH is, do you know what WASH is? Okay, it's fine, more to learn. WASH is water, sanitation, and hygiene, and it's a whole sector of the development arena, particularly in emergencies, but also in development. UNICEF uses it a lot. And so the WASH in Schools agenda was this agenda really pushing to, it had nothing to do with periods originally, was just around hand washing, getting kids to use toilets because it brings down the rates of disease, infectious disease, and so on. But they started, there was a wonderful champion, a Turkish fellow, Murat Sahin at UNICEF, who became a close colleague. He really started to push UNICEF and the WASH in Schools community to take on this issue. I started to develop puberty books. I have a bunch of them here, and I'll talk about them at the end. At the time, I had only done, I think, one in Tanzania. Now we've done quite a number of them. But again, and then also family planning community, but they weren't really thinking about it the way we were. Milestones, there started to be really rigorous qualitative work on the issue. The barriers, there started to be more public-private partnerships, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, some of the big sanitary pad companies. People have different opinions about that, but they really started to engage. And then an explosion started of social entrepreneurs. There really, lots of people started to think there have to be better pads, there have to be better underwear. The ones that the big companies have are too pricey. Maybe I can come up with a better solution. So they really started to respond to this issue. And then during the next wave, 2012 to 2015, continuing to be a focus on girls. Again, if you'll note, in high-income countries, it's still here, was really much more individual and clinical. There isn't a lot of attention to puberty up until now. And low and middle-income countries continue this public health approach. More research on the barriers. There started to be some sort of randomized trials around interventions, analyses of measures, the link between menstruation interventions and reproductive tract infections, sexually transmitted infections. The Canadian government at UNICEF's pushing gave $6 or $7 million to go look in 14 countries in schools to find out about menstruation as a barrier. There started to be these Break the Silence campaigns led by various organizations, and more advocates and social entrepreneurs with a real focus on products got involved and the stigma issues. Myself at Columbia partnered with UNICEF in 2011, I think, to launch a virtual conference on menstruation in schools and addressing it. And just to show how that shifted, so I think we started in 2011, 2012 was maybe the first one. We had, I think, 70 people online, and I don't remember, 16 submissions in year one, and by 2017, which was the last one I was involved in, we had over 1,000 people online, and 60 or 70 submissions. So really, this issue is exploding. I had asked UNICEF for some money, and again, this may be something you encounter in your work. There started to be so many people doing this issue and thinking about schools, and it was all landing in my inbox. And I cannot manage the menstrual, I was like, well, you need, and I can't stand when people reinvent the wheel or don't play in the sandbox together. And so I would, I'd get a million emails a day. Oh, I'm doing this here and I'm doing this. I'm like, could you please talk to each other? But that just started to be like too much. And so I asked for some funding to bring together non-governmental organizations, researchers, donors, NGOs, UN agencies, national governments, everyone thinking about schools to say, okay, what's our 10-year strategy? What's our vision? Where are we trying to go? How can we all be in the sandbox together? Maybe we're not all going to work together, but at least we have a common agenda and priorities. So we had that meeting. I'll talk about that later. We called it MHM in 10. The idea was from 2014 till 2024, we would somehow make a difference in transforming schools. We still have a long way to go. There was lobbying around the Sustainable Development Goals. Do you know what the SDGs are? Okay, so in the global development community, there was something called the Millennium Development Goals, which set out, do you know those? Is that familiar? For some of you. Okay, so it was global goals that were set up that we were going to reach over 10 or 15 years to make progress in health and education and gender equality and the environment. There's sort of a range of goals. When those were coming to an end, which was 2015, there started to be a very intense lobbying effort around what should be come after them. And what came after them is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17. There's a lot of fighting about that, like maybe we have too many and you can't meet them all. But as part of the process of lobbying to try and get menstruation and attention to this into the goals, we were asked to help with some of the WHO and UNICEF's lobbying on that issue. We realized we had no definition. It's very hard to lobby to measure something across countries if you don't even know what it consists of. So we came up with a definition. And then the big donors started to come up with funding, and there was a big sort of guidance document, Menstrual Hygiene Matters, which was published. So I just want to talk about the language. So this is the global definition we came up with in 2012. There's a lot of discussion around this definition now, and so I like to be very clear that there were 4 of us or 5 of us in a room who wrote this. It was not meant to be the end-all, be-all definition, but we needed a definition, and there were smart people in the room working on hygiene who really helped us think through what should go in here. But this was coming at it really from the perspective of water and sanitation and sort of, a very, very basic definition that could be part of this lobbying effort to be measured. So people are discussing it now. I think it's still a fine definition, but it's not enough. If you want to talk about supportive teachers or other issues, that goes beyond this definition, and that's fine. It really needs to be built out. But when I say revisit, it's that we wrote this back when the agenda in low and middle income countries was a little bit different, although it hasn't changed everywhere, and it focuses on women and girls, which is not sufficiently inclusive as the world has evolved now 6 years later. And so I talk about this definition when I give talks, but you have to think about what culture you're in, what country you're in, where that country is. I gave a talk in Nepal in December. It's a much more open-minded country. It's more like what's happening here, and so we talked about the need for a more inclusive definition. There are countries like Tanzania where I do a lot of work that is in some ways going backwards instead of forwards in terms of some of their policies, and I would probably not put this bubble up if I were giving a talk there, which is not to say it's not deeply important to be more inclusive, but when you do global work, you also don't want to get removed from the country. You have to find ways to work that meet where that country is. So then the last 2 years, just to wrap up this sort of review, the interest has expanded, 10 to 19-year-old girls and women. Much more interest in displaced populations. There's been these huge displacements around the world because of war or disasters. Finally, the rich countries are learning from the lower income countries, and they're starting to think about this from a public health perspective and not just in a rights perspective, not just clinically. More trials, much more evidence, and I've been working on some of this on what do we do in disasters and post-conflict, how do we best address the needs of those who menstruate, because a lot of the people from the big agencies that go in are uncomfortable with the issue and didn't have good guidance on how to respond. New measures, continuing to be interventions in schools, more advocacy. I call it an explosion of sanitary products. It's sort of, the number of emails I now get, oh, I'm developing a new pad. And I'm like, okay, great, go talk to that person. There's a lot of products out there. We launched a big toolkit around MHM emergencies. I'll come back to that. You see much more in the media. And then there's starting to be these campaigns. If you're not paying attention to this like we all obsessively do in the menstrual world, you may not have noticed. But there's legislation across the US and the UK around removing taxes on sanitary products. Frankly, I was embarrassed. I didn't even know they were still taxed. I never paid attention. I couldn't believe they were still taxed. But also sort of around equity issues. I was doing interviews on Monday with homeless women in New York around sort of their ability to access products and toilets, and starting to sort of think about period equity and period poverty, or menstrual equity and period poverty. How In fact, trying to just pay for a box of pads or tampons every month may be too much for many people, and what should we do about that as a sort of natural body process that you can't control. So just to say, if I haven't made it obvious, there is growing global attention on the need to address this issue. A lot of activity to break the silence. Addressing taboos, Plan International, which is a big NGO which actually does a lot of education work, came up with a period emoji. There's a new law in Nepal. Sometimes in the news you hear about these menstrual sheds where girls have to sleep in the far west region of Nepal. I'm not sure that a ban and a criminalization of it is the answer. In fact, I was reading one of my students' papers last night all about why that may not be the best solution, but just to say that it's in the news and some governments are trying to do things. Beginning to engage boys and men. There's really not enough engagement of boys and men. And how many men in the room were sat down and told about periods when you were growing up? Good. Okay, not all of you. And was that in school or? Home. Okay, everybody was at home?
We had classes in elementary school.
Elementary school. I wonder if that's state dependent. What state you were in? New Jersey? New Jersey?
Pennsylvania did it when I was growing up in elementary school.
They did or they didn't?
They did.
Okay, all right.
I don't know if they still do.
Right. No, I know. That's the thing. It's very political, yeah? And there's only 27 states, I think, 24 or 27, because we're doing a review right now, that actually have mandated sex ed in schools. And the challenge is that even if you just want to talk about periods, it's rolled into sex ed. So if a school system doesn't want sex ed, then you don't even learn about puberty. So again, it is very state dependent. But obviously boys need to know about it as well. We started doing boys' puberty books for that reason, but not just for that reason. We also felt boys have a lot of questions. Very few people talk to boys. When I started to do research with boys in Tanzania, a number of people, including my own father, I say that because my cousin's in the front row, said, well, why are you doing research with boys? They can figure it out for themselves. And I'm not going to ask the men, I'm not going to poll the men in the room if that was what you were told, but we then went to Tanzania and had a lot of people say, why are you doing this? Girls need help, not boys. And then we did our book and we handed it out. I don't think I brought a copy, but we handed it out to boys, 10 and 11-year-old boys, and we had captured their stories about wet dreams and erections, and sorry, I know this is about periods and not that, but the feedback we got, we had a lot of boys say, I thought I had syphilis, or I thought I was dying, or when I saw my first wet dream. They didn't know either. And we're very grateful to have something to read. And then, of course, we tucked in something about gender dynamics and menstruation to try and bridge some of that divide. So yes, for boys and men. So attention primarily, although I'm not going to get into too much specific, has been on the school agenda. It's not sufficient. We have a lot more to do to understand what the most cost-effective and sort of best responses are to make schools physically and socially comfortable environments. We also need to learn a lot more beyond schools. So more recently, there's been work on emergencies, as I said, as well. But just to give you an idea why this is relevant for schools, this again just indicates sort of the secrecy around it. So you learned in school, so obviously these kids may or may not be learning from home. We find they often are not. This was Ethiopia. We did this in, I think, 2011, before when we were doing our Ethiopia book. So the first time I menstruated, I had stomach cramps. I was very shocked. It lasted for 4 days. I told my friend I'd started menstruating because my mother didn't tell me about it before. It's because my mother never learned about it, and it's very taboo. We actually have a story in here, and it's what's been interesting to me is that governments have approved these books, even when sometimes I think they won't like certain stories. A number of girls wrote stories, so we included one about a father who saw her washing out her menstrual cloth, which is quite taboo in a lot of countries. And thought she'd been having sex because she had her period, and so wanted to beat her, and the mother got between them. That came up in Ghana. It's come up in other countries. So sort of these misconceptions around periods. If a girl gets it earlier than maybe the mother did, and they don't understand why, and what was she doing. So really it has profound implications on them. This I took from some colleagues at Emory. They did work in the Philippines and in Bolivia. When we they call it our sickness. Actually, you probably can translate that. You shouldn't walk at all with boys because that's how we get pregnant. So again, there's this real don't play with boys, don't walk with boys, which is really not super helpful if you want to understand what you should and shouldn't be doing to not get pregnant. And then this from the Philippines, what is known by her parents is that she's studying well, but this is not the truth because of what is happening to her when she has her period at school. So I just think issues of concentration, anxiety in the classroom, not feeling supported, we have not done a good job of trying to measure that in a compelling way The donor community, which I will talk about briefly later, is very obsessively interested in absenteeism and dropout, which are really hard to sort of align to just your period and education performance, which to me is really tricky. At that end of year of test, did she do well on that exam because she had toilets or not? I mean, how do you show of all the things that could impact her education? So, but that's the data they want, whereas I think if we could do a better job of saying she can't concentrate, or she leaves class for half an hour, or she gets punished, there are other ways we could make it more compelling. But I'm just curious, of those who menstruate, if there were no toilets on the entire Drexel campus, would you come when you had your periods? You probably wouldn't come anyway because you couldn't do anything else. But yeah, just to say, it's really a lot of half the schools in low-income countries don't have toilets or water. So just primary schools. So what did we see in schools? Again, I have slides like this, but theirs are better. These were from some, not to suggest, because I think sometimes when people hear about this issue, they're thinking, oh, this is in Africa or this is in Asia, but this is Bolivia. Emery took these slides, sort of what the girls' toilets look like. Disposal, a whole other issue I'm not going to get into today, but if you work in the environment, that's a whole other thing, how things are disposed. This was a slide, again, from Emery colleagues, their work in the Philippines. Sort of just oftentimes you go, if you go to schools in low-income countries, there will be locks on the outside because they want to control access and keep them clean, but that doesn't really help an 11-year-old or a 15-year-old girl if she needs to go just to go then get a key, and hostile design around your ability to, this came up, I mean, it's a whole digression, but with the homeless women on Monday, how many fast food places you now need a code or a password or a key, and you have to buy something and they may not be able to afford it. So just the ways in which the environment can be friendly or not friendly if you have your period. We spent, as part of the MHM in 10 meeting we had in 2014, we tried to map out what do we not know and what do we know, because even though we couldn't get any funding to do anything, it was such a new issue, we thought, well, if we map out the research agenda, maybe that will spur some donor investment. So we came up with a paper. We talked about the areas where there are research priorities, where you needed measure standardization, but we also articulated that you needed to go beyond school. PMA 2020 is not something you need to know. It's just a good example of something that Johns Hopkins did. They got some funding to do these national some national surveys in Nigeria and India and a number of countries. There are national surveys that look at lots of other things, but they included some questions on menstruation and how girls and women are managing, which was really useful because if you go to a donor or government and say, look, this is national data around the challenges they're having, it's much more impactful than saying, I did a study in 2 schools. So national data is really valuable. Again, we've tried to articulate a lot of things to encourage investment as we attempt to get funding. So a number of years ago, we tried to highlight how menarche, the first time you get your period, is this window of opportunity. Countries around the world, including ours, in certain states, don't want to talk about sex. And also, when you start getting into, when you're more vulnerable to risky behaviors, oftentimes it's a little bit late to start sort of trying to intervene or sort of prevent behaviors. So we tried to say, if you can see that first period as an opportunity to talk to girls, a little trickier with boys, that's a separate lecture. You don't necessarily know when they start getting erections or have their first wet dream, but with girls, oftentimes they tell somebody. And it can be a wonderful time to start talking to them, to make them feel supported. It could be an entry point for more sensitive SRH education. It could be a role for parents, something you could open up. They may not want to talk about sex, but talking about periods maybe is less scary to them. How many people's parents talk to them about growing up and body change? Okay, so not sort of half, but not even, yeah. So just to say, one of the things I love about doing global work is the universality of experiences around the world. And I will say parents around the world don't want to talk about periods or anything else. And it's both wonderful and maddening because somebody needs to talk to kids. But whether or not that's going to be parents, that may not be our solution. We just highlighted that we didn't have enough measures. I'm going to come back to this briefly later. But there are a number of trials. Again, you need good measures to sort of move governments and to monitor what you're doing and to get investment. UNICEF asked me to do an analysis, so I brought in the head of UN Girls Education Initiative and an education colleague a number of years ago to say, okay, well, let's look at the education policies. We know that the water sanitation community is pushing this, but they don't have the budget to really transform schools. So how's the education sector doing? To be fair, the education sector plans and policies we looked at are often 10-year strategies. So there's a reason why they wouldn't have included anything. It's a very new issue. But we took a generous look at them. We came up with proxies. Do they have gender segregated toilets? That's essential for managing your period in many contexts. So these were some of the things we searched on. It didn't have to be menstruation. It didn't have to be periods. But let's just say they did not do very well. Very little attention. And if it doesn't go into an education sector plan, it doesn't go get a line item in the budget that the Ministry of Finance passes. And if there's no line on budget, it doesn't matter what's in the policy, it will never happen. So it was useful to do this. We were also trying to push the education community to own this issue a little. They've really been quite resistant. I think they think it's a water sanitation issue, although that's starting to change. I already mentioned, but this was the 10-year agenda we came up with. The common vision that by 2024, girls around the world, I would change this language now again to be more inclusive, are knowledgeable about and comfortable with their menstruation and able to manage their menses in school in a comfortable, safe, and dignified way. I think what this also leaves out is female teachers who often get ignored, but I know from my own experience, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Eritrea in East Africa, the female teacher in my school I was 23 and not thinking. She just was never there for a week every month, and people would say, oh, she's sick. And it took me like 6 months to be like, wait a minute. Why is she always sick for 5 days every month? And I finally realized, oh, because there's no toilet. So of course she's not coming for 5 days every month. And I think she may have had bad cramps and so on. But just to say, female teachers really get overlooked a little bit, and we need to address that as well. And what was interesting is what came out of the end of the meeting, along with 5 priorities, and I'm happy to tell you where to go read more, was that having champions, a massive champions at the local level, was what would transform this issue. Charismatic, sort of engaged, dedicated people who wanted to see this change at the local level was the only way you will see change in countries, which I think is very true. Just to say, I was excited to see that in the UN Girls Education Initiative, so UNESCO does a lot of the education monitoring around the world, for better or worse, in terms of the quality of data they have to work with. But they did put out this report, UNGAI, the UN Girls Education Initiative in UNESCO last year, where they did highlight sort of percentage of single-sex toilets, gender equality topics in their curricula, and including SRH. So you're starting to see, and part of this is, I think, because UNGAI is really invested in trying to address menstruation, probably more so than trying to sort of pull along the global education community with them. We started to look at MHM in emergencies. So enormous numbers of girls and women displaced. This is probably a little bit lower now, but they often lack access to materials, toilets, privacy is non-existent. The responders, the number of organizations don't know what to do. This was a quote from our research in Tanzania on this issue at the border where Burundian and Congolese refugees were coming. Menstruation doesn't know you're displaced, that you're traveling, it will come. So while you're on the road, for others, it may come when you arrived. So again, if a massive airstrike or a huge eruption or, I don't know, something terrible happened in Philadelphia right this minute, and we just all started running, and we ran wherever we ran for hours, and we ended up somewhere, and we all just had to stay there for days and days and days until they figure out what's going on in Philly. How many of you who have periods in the room would like, wait, before I run, I need to go buy some tampons? It's not like you go grab that and you run with that. So they're running, they're fleeing, they have children, they have pots, they have whatever else. Bringing menstrual supplies is not the first thing. And then you're sort of, if you remember seeing the pictures of the refugees crossing Europe, there's no privacy. They're climbing fields and fences and in train stations packed in and crossing sort of deserts, wherever they are. And it's just, it's so not something people want to talk about, but it doesn't mean your period doesn't come and you don't have to be able to manage it. And if you have blood on your skirt and you're already traumatized from whatever you just saw, now you have to deal with that, and you have to go get water, and you have to get food for your kids or help your mother. So just to say, it's really been a little bit too invisible and perceived as not important, which I think we would disagree with. Because if you have to stand in line for 6 hours to get your distribution in the camp, or you have to walk for days, you still have to deal with your period. So this was just from the schools, this was in the camp in Tanzania, just sort of girls articulating that they didn't like when they were, because there's often schools in these camps, because they may be protracted long-term emergencies. The reusables they gave didn't dry fast enough. I can talk a lot about that. How learning in the classroom is problematic. But what we did is we came up with a global guidance document that 27 organizations co-published. It's free and downloadable online. And just suggested these were the 3 things people need to be dealing with. materials, not just the pads, but do they have a bucket? Do they have soap? Do they have little clothespins? Do they have a flashlight so it's safe to go at night and use a latrine? They need to know how to use the materials. We were in Myanmar, and they were given disposable pads, and we found out nobody knew how to use them. And no one had taught them. They were used to using cloth. So there's that. Supportive facilities, toilet, bathing, laundering. If you have only one bucket in the family, the rest of the family may not want you washing your menstrual cloth or your underwear in that same bucket that their clothes are. There's a lot of taboos. And then knowing what's happening to your body, how to manage in that environment, and so on. Just to say, there are 14 chapters, and there's a whole Education in Emergencies organization, INEE, if you end up getting into that field of work. And we had a whole chapter just on what the education sector should be thinking about. So they would start to own it a little bit more in emergencies, and I think they are. You need to have female-friendly and safe toilets in schools, train the staff to be supportive, and have a stock of pads in case a girl gets her period when she's not expecting it. And then, as I mentioned, we've started doing these puberty books. This is from a book we helped to support in Laos. A book is not going to solve the issue. I have donors say to me, oh, you gave them your books. Do they all go to school when they have their periods? And I say, well, I didn't build toilets, and I didn't train the teachers to be supportive. This is a very simple intervention that is best in tandem with other interventions. So just to say, it's not a magic bullet, any more than a pad is a magic bullet if you don't have a toilet to change your pad in school. And so there's much left to be done. Just to run through quickly, who are we talking about? So I had a student help me find these figures. This is sort of less developed and least developed countries. These are millions and hundreds of millions of girls between the age of sort of getting their period for the first time, having to figure out how to manage it and stay safe. And yet it is such an under-addressed issue, except it's half the population, right? And here in the US too, we need to be doing more. We still lack evidence on other issues. I know this isn't your area of work, but we know very little about working women. Again, would all the working women in this building or all the menstruators come if there were no toilets? How do the bus drivers going around Philadelphia manage? I don't know. Are there female taxi drivers? But in low-income context, if you sit in a marketplace for 8 hours a day, where do you go? How do you manage? So again, we know little about slums where many people live, and also workplace. So we're trying to push for more funding to start looking at this, sort of garment factories. They have these 8-hour, 9-hour, 10-hour shifts in Asia in particular. How do they manage? Are there toilets? Are they allowed to use them? Do they have cloths or pads? Really won't get into this, but it occurred to me, we're now starting to talk about periods. We're not talking about, and I think probably for those who don't bleed in the room, even for those who bleed, talking about all the other kinds of bleeding that women deal with, whether it's postpartum, miscarriage, you have fibroids, there's so much bleeding, and there is like this silence. We don't talk about the access to toilets and supplies. We don't talk about information. I was at a UNFPA, had a big meeting last May or June in South Africa, and I was asked to give a talk, and they said, what do you want to talk on? It was all about menstruation, and I said it was the first time they were doing it, and so I think they really wanted me to say, I'll talk about periods. I said, can I talk about all the other kinds of vaginal bleeding? And I thought they would say, no, but they didn't, to their credit. And they said, sure. So it was very awkward. I went out on the stage, and there's like 300 people, and I'm saying, I'm here to talk about vaginal bleeding beyond periods. How many people in the room ever got told anything about vaginal bleeding? And in this room of, I would say, 300, mostly women across Africa, I would say maybe 5 raised their hands. Just to say silence beyond silence. And then afterwards, they didn't want to ask me questions. All these people came up once I was off the stage to say, can I tell you? Can I tell you? So there's so much left to be done on this issue, probably impacting some in schools as well. I had a student this semester who had endometriosis, and in the beginning of the semester she said, I just have to tell you I'm not going to be here certain days because I'm going to be in so much pain. And I was so grateful. I was very sad that that was her experience, but I was grateful she felt comfortable enough to tell me that, and then I would get emails sometimes with her telling me that was an issue. Explosion, as I've already said, in attention to products, which is exciting, and innovations, and legislation, and tampon tax. We don't have a lot of data, I will say, on what are people's actually experiences in public schools in higher income countries, amongst homeless, amongst incarcerated, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing stuff, but I just always think if you have some empirical evidence to shore up the advocacy, it will serve you well, which is why we've just started to do this project with the homeless in New York City. Again, I already talked about these goals, but just so you can see them, I forgot I had a slide. I have only 5 with bubble marks here that menstruation is relevant to, but we had a meeting, which I'll quickly go through, where the meeting participants from all these different sectors came away from the meeting and said, you know what, it's relevant to all 17 in some way or another. So I'm not going to spend time telling you why, because I want to finish up, but just to say, this moment is a great opportunity. There's more attention. There's starting to be more donor, interest. There's still a lot we need to learn, but there is a lot of wonderful energy around this. And then just sort of the last couple slides, I do feel very strongly. Clearly, I think because I said that idea about having a school strategy, for all of this, we will go a lot further together than we will alone. So we had some funding this spring. We got a different UN agency to bring together gender people, education people, WASH people, sexual reproductive health people, psychosocial people in Geneva for 3 days to say, okay, we don't have measures that are moving this agenda. We're over here worrying about periods and anxiety, and the donors are over there in education saying, well, show us absenteeism, and SRH is saying, well, what about fertility? And we're not all speaking to each other, and you all have priorities, and you all get a lot of money, and you have big global sort of agenda items on the SDGs. So how can we marry what we're all trying to do and see where the synergies are? Because if a girl doesn't know what's happening to her body, how is she ever going to really use family planning effectively? And if she can't manage her period, how is she going to meet her educational sort of outcomes? And so it was a really fantastic opportunity. We have a long way to go, but it was good to be in the room together for 3 days to hash it. I spent last weekend, all of last weekend, working on the report, but that's okay. It's worth it. We sort of had this super goal. Again, this should be more inclusive, but this idea that girls live in societies that, we focused on girls only for this meeting because that's really the only evidence we have right now, and it's hard to do measures if you don't have evidence. Live in societies that enable them to be confident and knowledgeable about their menstruation and able to manage it with dignity, safety, and comfort, thereby promoting their health, well-being, and ability to realize their potential and equitable role in society, which clearly has strong links to education. We had invited menstrual hygiene experts, but also global monitoring measures experts from all those sectors that I mentioned. So we tried to show them on day 1, why do we think this is relevant? Here's, for example, my colleague at Save the Children. If you have inadequate schools for enabling it, teachers maybe not be able to teach comprehensive sexuality education, don't have enough education materials, schools or environments are not conducive, girls maybe don't participate at much, can't concentrate, and then what are the kinds of outcomes that may lead to? So that was our effort to try and show the education experts why we thought it was relevant and not just a WASH issue. And then we had UNESCO's global monitoring person with us, Nicole Bella, who was fantastic. And she had already pulled out, well, I asked her to give a talk, but she pulled out where she thought in the SDGs, which is where all the governments and donors are going, she put into bold all the places she thought menstruation already aligned with the indicators and targets for the SDGs under education and gender, which is good. We just need to. So then I'm just going to conclude here to come back to Jackie's sort of call to us all. Is that you have to keep those who menstruate at the center of anything you do, whether it's research or practice or policy work, as the knowers of their own lives. So that was rapid fire.
So we have a few minutes for question and answer, so we can start in the room, and I'll let you know if anyone types something.
Okay. Yeah.
I was at an event recently, earlier this year, of startups coming out of Stanford.
Yeah.
And one of them, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. One of them was, I was the only female in the room during that thing, and I was the only one who reacted very strongly about the presentation. So it was a couple of young female entrepreneurs out of Stanford who, as you might say, are reinventing the wheel with
Yeah.
pads.
Yeah.
In that they want to put, that they're working on putting this like little contraption in the pad itself, that like once you're menstruating, you can connect that, the pad, or like take the piece of the blood out of it and connect it to something so it can test your blood. Tell you if you have HPV or whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
These are things that you can already have medical access to.
Yeah.
And like your thoughts on someone kind of reinventing the wheel that way.
Yeah.
And that effort and like those resources are
Yeah.
spent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hard question. I was at an NIH, the National Institutes of Health, is where a lot of us try to get funding. And they had a symposium in March not in March, in September, and I spoke more on the global perspective, and there was someone there who does innovation. I don't know if it's the same person, it was a tampon that you insert, and then afterwards you use it to assess different types of sort of blood-related things. I don't know what to say about that, because I think a lot of the countries where we work don't have good access to medical care, but I'm also not sure that them self-diagnosing with their pad, and if you're really going to get that technology out to the middle of nowhere, is necessarily going to serve them that well either. And at least when I went to nursing school, one of the things that we were trained in was there are ethical issues around diagnosing if there's no treatment available. And is it always appropriate to do so? And not to say people don't deserve to know what they know, but if there is no nearby solution, you need to think through, should I really be testing for this if there's no care available? So, I also never would have come up with the phone or any of the other things that people have come up with. So I'm not going to comment on like whether we should, certain levels of innovation that are very out of the box. There's a lot of things we could be spending money on other than that, because I think, so one of the things is, it's not a good example, but it's an example. I don't know if it's a good analogy. So for these books, we distribute in hard copies. Organizations, donors, countries order them. UNICEF, Ministry of Education, UNICEF just ordered another 24,000 in different languages. We also have them available for mobile download through a nonprofit. And I keep getting encouraged, you need to do apps, you need to do more digital content in these countries where you work, which sounds like a good idea. I mean, the world is going digital, but I kept thinking, that's not my experience in a lot of these countries. There's a big gender divide in mobile access. 10 to 14-year-old girls in rural Africa or in Asia, I'm not sure they have. So I went to Tanzania for a week in March and hung out with a bunch of primary schools and secondary, so elementary level, middle, and high school. And my team member's going to Kenya to do the same thing next week. And 10 to 14-year-olds don't have phones or computers. They really don't touch their mothers. And when they did have access to computers, it was often their brothers or their fathers. So it was like classic. You read a report, you're like, is that really true? And they're like, yeah, I guess that's really true. So it sounds good. And then it was interesting because I had discussions with digital content people in Tanzania who I really wanted to work with because they're entrepreneurial and they really want to push the country along. And I said, well, okay, but this is a great idea if we did this and we could push it out. But, I'm hearing that these girls don't have phones or access. Oh, well, Marnie, you should plan for 5 years from now. Just focus on that. I'm like, well, why don't we do both? Because there's millions of girls right now who have no access. So sure, let's try to figure that out for the day when and if they have it. But in the meanwhile, you don't want to leave behind. So, I think it's a balance. I just think that the innovation in a lot of these places, we want them to be further than they really are. But yet at the same time, innovation's good, usually. So, but interesting. I might have been annoyed too, but I don't know. Did you say something?
Well, it was a recording, so
Oh, okay.
if they weren't in the room, which is probably a good thing, because as soon as they ended up with a really, really bad time.
Yeah.
Like the screen, the entire thing was like thematically colored, like
Yeah.
grades as well.
Yeah.
So that was already too much for me.
Yeah.
And then at the end of it, there said like blah 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 blah, period. And as many people in this room know of me, I sometimes react without thinking.
Don't we all sometimes?
Yeah. What I said was, well, that's just stupid.
Yeah.
And then like all of them looked at me and I kept saying why I thought that.
Yeah.
And they just did not understand where I was coming from.
Yeah.
But I also think it didn't help that I was thinking of it not just as a female, but as an Egyptian female.
Yeah.
And being very aware of not just the lack of, well, the different kind of logic that's being used in that setting of
Yeah.
that product, but like how like access is generally very difficult and how periods are taboo and like
Yeah.
when you have like even when you have your period,
Yeah.
like working there and like living there, growing up there, like if you have your period and you want to go change your pad or your tampon, you have to hide it.
I don't think that's so different
Hide it in
here.
your shoes.
How many menstruators in this room wave their tampon around when they go to the bathroom here?
It's in my hand, it's not hidden.
But is it even in your hand usually?
Yeah.
Because I asked a bunch of master students last year, like, oh, there's no stigma here. I said, how many of you walk down the hall with your tampon in your hand? And they're like, okay, well, go ahead.
I used to.
They tuck it in their sleeve, they put it in their pocket. Yeah, go ahead.
I got better at not making it hidden when I was teaching in the public school system.
Yeah.
Because I wanted those girls to feel
Mm.
I have to go to the restroom.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, even in the U.S., like,
Yeah.
even in the most affluent places,
Yeah.
it is still very, like,
Yeah.
and so I tried, like, as I got older, right, when you're
Yeah.
younger, it's
Yeah.
But as I got older, I tried not to do that.
Yeah.
Just to show that it is something that happens.
Yeah.
It's hard. For people
It's very
because
hard.
it's such a
Yeah. There's this wonderful, one of my team members found it, I don't know if I could find it again. There's this wonderful video that I think some girls in an international, and boys in an international school in Nepal in Kathmandu made. So, okay, they're at the international school. They're already coming from a certain class probably. But it's this wonderful, it's too long to ever go viral. It's this wonderful video where a girl wakes up and she said, this is my perfect day. And, you know, she goes to school and she's slumped like this. And the three boys, she says, what's wrong? Do you have your period? Can I help you? Can I get you some medicine? Like, it's this sort of alternative universe that never exists around what her perfect, and I was like, wow, why isn't it like that? Which is why I do feel very strongly, this is not just a menstruator's issue, it's everybody's issue for this society. You know, again, it was the same thing. She goes to gym and she's sort of struggling. And not to suggest that you struggle when you have your period, because not everybody does, but sometimes you are very uncomfortable. And the male gym teacher says, she said, what's going on? Well, I'm here. Oh, do you want to rest? Whatever you need. Take off time. You know, come in. Can I do? And it was just this it wasn't hidden. It was a world where it wasn't hidden. And not only not hidden, but there was active engagement. And one of my favorite videos, so one of these digital content groups that I found in Tanzania, they're trying to push out little learning videos around this. And my favorite video was not the one. They were so excited. They're great, but they're so excited about this one where a girl goes to school and she doesn't have a pad and how she solves the not having a pad issue. And like, I don't know, the school helped her, which is fine. That's important. But the one I really loved is a girl's not, because I thought that's more transformative in that society. The girl's not going to school. She's laying around. And the father, I think there is no mother. And the father's like, why don't you go to school? And they have this whole conversation. And eventually she says, Daddy, I need money. I can't pay for products. And he said, oh, why didn't you say something? And so I think if something like that could go viral in the country, again, it's a little bit too long, but to really transform those norms around supporting your children and whose responsibility it is and making it something you don't have to hide. So we've never done a book in Egypt, just going to say. No, I would love to, yeah. Yeah.
Tampons, like they're hidden in pharmacies because they're taboo, because if you're using tampons, then
You're having
like,
sex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you're a whore and like
Yeah.
all these things. And you're
Yeah.
So in pharmacies, they hide them.
Yeah.
And like they only like give them to you if you ask for it, and they keep
Yeah.
you wearing the wedding ring.
Yeah.
Then you're not a slut.
Wow. So interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think it would be great.
No, I'd love, we have never done the Middle East. I'd like to. It's another conversation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
So I just wanted to ask of your opinion
Yeah.
on how you deal with feedback from more affluent women that
Yeah.
are opposed to methods of menstrual products like cloth pads.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this because last summer I actually had the opportunity to work in Lesotho. So
Yeah.
I'm originally from Ghana.
Oh, we have a Ghana book. Here.
So I heard you
It's
speak
in Twi in English. Oh, you probably don't know Twi. Is Twi your, what's your?
I do speak Twi.
Oh, okay.
But as part of my project, I was helping to identify sustainable products for
Yeah.
menstrual hygiene.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that we ended up doing was the cloth pad.
Mm.
And I was there for only 10 weeks, and it took so long for me to be able to get with
Yeah.
the community because a lot of the more affluent women could not just bring themselves to the fact that someone would have to wash the blood from
Yeah.
a cloth pad.
Yeah.
So then they try to just, brush it under the rugs, like, oh, they don't have water, they don't
Yeah.
have soap, they don't
Yeah.
have. And meanwhile, these girls were actually, some of them, I conducted some focus groups with actually, one of them had 12 participants and 10 were males,
Hmm.
which I was very, very amazed by.
Hmm.
But some of them shared that during their periods, they use items like socks or
Yeah.
sheepskin.
Yeah.
The sheep in the sutu have very thick wool, so
Yeah.
that it can absorb the blood.
Yeah.
But then after they wash the sheepskin for so long, the hide becomes very hard.
Yeah.
So it starts to cut in between their thighs.
Yeah.
But they do that because they want to go to school.
Yeah.
So, the fact that these women were just like, oh, don't, like, let's just focus on getting funding for
Disposable.
pads. Meanwhile, I was trying to teach them how to sew and, like, make their own
Yeah.
pads. So I just wanted to know if you could share a little more on
Yeah.
some pushback that you've
Yeah.
gotten and how you...
Yeah. It's interesting because I usually get the pushback in the other direction, which is don't talk about, I stay a little bit away from the products because my feeling is people should use whatever they can afford and makes sense and is culturally appropriate. And it's a bit of a battle zone. But I would, and not necessarily in a bad way, but So what we often find is that there is the donors, everybody's trying to push the reusables because they're worried about sustainability, they're worried about the impact on the environment. I'm a little uncomfortable with pushing reusables only because my feeling is I get to use whatever I want. If they want disposables, let them have unless you're going to tell me I can't use what I want, why should they have to get something that may or may not work that well? I think reusables that have a snap and you can, not just a cloth that moves around, so what we've often found particularly in refugee contexts when we tend to do more interviews with sort of older women, middle-aged women, and younger girls and women is the young girls and women all want disposables because they're easier. And then the older women are much more comfortable with cloth or they think the disposables cause cancer, so often we get this generational thing. I think, and then the other thing that happened in the Tanzania camps, we heard there were these reusables that are great made by Ugandan company Afropads. I don't know if they've made them if they're in Lesotho. You've probably heard of them. They do a lot of social media. And so they were in the camps. And actually in 2 of the camps when we were there was no water. So they were throwing them out. Because they said, we can't rewash these. There's no water. Or there's nothing so we just throw them out. Which I'm like, couldn't you just held on to it till there was. But I mean, in their minds, there's no water. And I don't know when there's going to be water again. Now, what are they using instead? I don't know. And then the other issue with some of the reusables is, for example, the color. And if you're in a camp or, and you have this bright pink or blue, or there's concerns around people being able to see what it is. But I think there is certainly pushback. I think what you have to say is what are their options? If it's nothing or this, and they're okay with this, then let's do this as an interim. And then or maybe it's on interim, but I think you just have to say it's this, one of the things also when people do surveys in camps, and particularly with displaced, and they will ask girls and women, and I'm just saying girls and women because that's generally the way in a lot of displacement settings right now, it's sort of articulated. They will say, do you want reusables or disposable? And oftentimes they will say reusables, and then everyone says, oh, well, everybody prefers reusables. And I say, that's fine, but you need to go a little deeper. Are they saying reusables because they're smart, and they know you're not going to keep bringing disposable? If you really want to get a preference, I think you need to understand why they're articulating certain things, and that's fine because you're absolutely right. Reusables, they can reuse, they can last for a couple of years, or at least for many, many months. And so all of that are huge benefits, and it is a huge environmental issue. But they do need to have an enabling environment for the reusables, right? So they do need to have soap, laundry soap, bucket, water, somewhere to dry it. So I think and probably what you tried to do is say there's a middle ground. What they're using obviously has health issues and is uncomfortable, and who knows what's on that sheepskin and how they're really cleaning it. The disposables are not affordable, so let's find them something they can do, and maybe one day they'll have more purchasing power and the pads will be there, and they'll be, in a perfect world, they'll be biodegradable, and I don't know if we'll ever get there, but we're not there yet. So I think that would be sort of, but I'm guessing you probably tried that approach.
Yes, I mean, I ended up just working directly with the community
without
the supervisory role,
Yeah.
and then got as much community involvement as I thought.
They know, yeah.
And then in the end, the community went to my supervisors and were basically like, yeah, we wanted this, and we're so grateful that she did this.
Yeah.
And then the supervisors were like, oh yeah, of course, we told her to do it. And I'm like, of course you did.
Yeah, good answer. My feeling is if you got where you needed to go, who cares?
Exactly.
Right? Who cares? Yeah. Right.
Everybody was happy, but
Right. Yeah, no, it is. There's strong feelings around products, which is partly why I've stayed away. But no, it sounds like you did perfectly. So.